Bosses are a staple of Pikmin. Each of the three mainline entries in the Pikmin series has had some form of boss enemies, though the specifics vary heavily. Each game is a little different in regards to how it treats the presentation power and plentitude of its bosses. There is, however, one thing that can be seen as a clear trend between Pikmin games. Each Pikmin game has pushed the scale of its bosses to always be far bigger than the last. Now, with the perspective change, there's a good chance this continues, and seeing how large some bosses from Pikmin 3 were already, it's probably going to be huge. My name is Vantage Emblem, and today, we're talking about the increasing scope of Pikmin bosses and predicting what effect that might have on Pikmin 4. If you're new to the channel and interested, we do Pikmin videos weekly here, so please subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. That being said, without further ado, let's get looking at some bosses. We're going to start by talking about Pikmin 1. Pikmin 1's bosses are pretty much just slightly bigger enemies that happen to be in an arena. They have pretty much no impact on their arena, they're just enemies that are put in a rather stagnant location that doesn't change much. But these locations are emphasized as the focal points of whatever maps they're on, being circles kind of towards the border or in central locations that players will naturally come to. The scale of these enemies, being slightly bigger enemies, doesn't mean they aren't hard. They're just not as developed as the bosses of later games. And this is similar to a lot of things in Pikmin 1, which was a rather experimental title. Of the bosses, only 2 bosses got boss music, and they're clearly bigger in scale and power than the other enemies. These are the Beady Longlegs and the Emperor Bulblex respectively, each which receive their own battle themes. The other bosses in this game may simply be mini-bosses by design, and looking at them from this lens, they fit the bill nicely. Of the remaining 6 bosses, 5 of them, the Puffstool, the Burrowing Snagret, the Armored Cannon Beetle, the Mamuta, and the Gulex, each are treated by the game as if they are of the same intensity as the calcified Crushblat of Pikmin 3. Merely a big enemy in an arena, nothing more. Only the Smoky Prog, an optional enemy with extraneous circumstances surrounding it, seems to undeniably fall into the category of boss. This enemy lacks any sort of battle theme, however, and this may be because of its optional nature. That all being said, Pikmin 1 is the first game in the series, it doesn't really have any place to grow from, so we're going to just take it as a baseline and move on to Pikmin 2. Pikmin 2's bosses are significantly bigger in scale and gravitas overall than Pikmin 1, and they're clearly not just enemies in an arena anymore. This is especially evidenced by the new boss theme and the structure of caves, with almost every one building up to a large boss fight at the end. Several of Pikmin 1's bosses return in Pikmin 2 as earlier game bosses. In every case of this happening, these enemies are now accompanied with heart-racing boss music, except for the Mamuta, which is now absolutely solidified as just being a big enemy, and the Armored Cannon Beetle, which only returns in a weaker larval form. Regarding the bosses from the first game that actually return as bosses in Pikmin 2, they all share something in common. They are bosses from Pikmin 1 that make the most use of their arena in that game, with the Emperor Bulblex, the Burrowing Snagret, and the Beady Longlegs all approaching their fight in an unconventional manner, emerging from either underground or above in a dramatic fashion. That being said, they all tend to first appear in the early to mid-game of Pikmin 2. Taking into account the stark difference in the sequel's length compared to the first Pikmin, each boss appears very early when compared proportionally to their appearances in Pikmin 1, fully solidifying the scale difference in the Pikmin 1 and 2 bosses, in regards to both size and power. Looking at Pikmin 2's original bosses, you'll notice that Pikmin 2's late game bosses utilize their arena to a much larger degree than the returning bosses do. For example, the late game Emperor Bulblex, which spawns babies and falling rocks, greatly expands its zone of control using these attacks. This boss requires players to go all the way around a large windy arena and to fight it on a much more unconventional front than its early game boss. In addition, the segmented Cropster also uses rocks, and these falling hazards make its already dangerous rolling attack downright lethal. It should be noted that these bosses do not directly change the terrain around them, perhaps because of limitations from the GameCube, but that these bosses are situated in unconventional terrain and use unconventional terrain to help give shape to the boss fight. This is taken to its extreme with the Water Wraith fight, where this boss hunts down players through its entire cave, allowing the otherwise standard, tight, watery corridors of the submerged castle to serve as a battleground against this monster. Moving on to Pikmin 3, we can see that this game's bosses are much bigger than past bosses, and that they take full advantage of the leap between two console generations. Each boss at least fully utilizes their arena, if not actually shapes it in some way. The armored Maldad, for example, climbs up the walls of its stump, and the mysterious life form takes its cues from the Water Wraith and pursues you through the corridors of its cavernous home. The scopes of these arenas are dramatically larger than that of past games, so much so that these bosses are never used in more than one arena, locked to their story progression-based battles. These locations are breathtaking. The Scornet Maestro is situated atop a very large in scale tree trunk, and the sand-belching Meerslug is located on a beautiful beach with spiring palm trees and shifting sands. Speaking of these sands, several bosses, the Meerslug among them, have an arena that physically warps around them according to their attacks and the player's response. The Behemoth Phosbat has an arena that dynamically lights based on the player's use of yellow Pikmin, and the photophobic Phosbat avoids these areas, effectively allowing each bulb lit in the arena to shrink the size of the overall battleground until the final phase of the fight, when all the lights are on. The sand-belching Meerslug, as stated before, exists in shifting sand, and its movement physically raises and lowers the ground beneath and above it in tandem with its attacks. The same thing is done by the Quaggled Mireclops with its muddy stomps that create puddles of water, and in a strange way also by the Plasm Wraith, which shrinks and shreds portions of its gold body as it receives damage. A much more primitive cousin to these sorts of effects were used for boss fights and other encounters in big-budget Wii games, which would have been in concurrent development with Pikmin 3 before its shift to the Wii U, such as the 1000-year Arachnid boss fight from Skyward Sword, which is heavily involved in the manipulation of sand. There is, therefore, a possibility that Pikmin 3's boss fights might have, in an earlier development build, already been using at least a primitive version of this terrain manipulation functionality, and given the game's final design, the scope of these bosses may have been a major design goal of the game even before its move to the Wii U. In fact, this is made clear by the returning bosses from the first two games, and the smaller new bosses that are added. These big enemies in the arena, which can be tackled freely in any time like the bosses of old, use the Pikmin 2 boss theme as their own, clearly a mini-boss theme this time around. The major bosses of the game, however, use either their own theme or a variation of a shared boss battle theme. Curiously, each new mini-boss and each returning mini-boss has the same shared characteristic of all of the returners from Pikmin 1 into Pikmin 2. Each makes a grand and perhaps surprise entrance from below or above, and is much larger than your everyday enemy. Knowing all this, we can clearly see that there is an increasing scope to the bosses of each of these games. For that reason, it follows that Pikmin 4's bosses may not only be larger than Pikmin 3's bosses, but they will also further utilize shifting terrain. Granted, this does not guarantee that they're going to have the dynamic raising and lowering terrain of Pikmin 3. That may have been a product of its time, a way to push the technical innovation of the Wii U, and may not be as necessary for Pikmin 4, especially given that it's going to be on Switch, which, despite being a more powerful console, also has some limitations in terms of battery life and power. It can handle Pikmin 3, so it probably could handle similar effects, but it may not push things too much farther in the hope that it can be played in handheld mode as well. My point with this is that we're probably going to see some sort of increased scale in terms of how the bosses use their environments, but it may not be of the same style as Pikmin 3's. I think a major part of how this may work is through the new camera perspective. This game's new perspective makes these bosses much more comparative to Zelda bosses, and probably pushes the scope of these encounters by showing you how tiny you are comparatively. What do I mean by this? Well, even a Bulborb from this new perspective is a much larger looking threat, as can be seen from the screenshot provided from Pikmin 4 or from shifting camera in Pikmin 3 Deluxe's second side story. Given the difficulty of aiming Pikmin from this perspective, should lock-on return, bosses are likely to have various weak points that must be targeted in order to effectively combat them. Again, a trope from Zelda. Looking at it this way, some returning Pikmin 3 bosses are also already very similar to Zelda bosses with no tweaks other than the perspective change. The Mireclops is, for example, quite like the Imprisoned from Skyward Sword, but without a time constraint. Pikmin 4's bosses may also have more verticality due to the perspective change, which means both the walls and floors of the arena shifting could change things. Imagine having to climb up the inside of the Armored Maldad's arena to reach it as it ascends to the top when injured, or having to climb up Zelda-like vines with your Pikmin to reach a second location of a fight against the Fosbat after having lit the first portion of its arena, only for it to fully utilize both sides once all of the lights are on. In fact, even the mini-boss scale enemies are much more imposing from this perspective. Imagine launching your Pikmin from beneath a large arachnorb, having to watch your Pikmin climb up the large, long-legged enemy that looms above, or having to deal with a towering Snagret that emerges from underground. Even think about an enemy like the bug-eyed Crawmad. It would take up most of the screen with its imposing body. And don't even get me started about what Wraiths could potentially look like from this perspective. I've seen Scruffy play Pikmin 2 in first person, and while that's not quite the same, they're almost definitely even more threatening from this camera angle. So that being said, what bosses do I think will return? Do I have any ideas for new bosses? I think I'm going to save those topics for a future video. But I really want to hammer here that the bosses we see will be bigger in scale no matter what. Even if they're bosses that are theoretically of the same size as Pikmin 1's bosses, the new camera angle is going to make them much more threatening. That being said, what do you think? What bosses do you think will return? What will the scale of the new and returning bosses be like? What's the new perspective going to do to them? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please remember to like and subscribe. As I said before, I post Pikmin videos roughly weekly in the style, so if you don't want to miss out, well, you know what to do. Anyway, my name is Vantage Emblem. I'll stop rambling and end things here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you again real soon. Cheers.